Welcome back to the Anglican Papalist. In episode 1, we named Where the Journey Ends. This episode, where it begins, with a break that went deeper than politics. The English Reformation was not only a theological dispute, it was the beginning of a new principle that the church could be managed by the state. And once that principle took hold, the question of authority in English Christianity was never really settled again. This is the deeper story beneath the familiar one. It's easy to think of the Reformation in terms of personalities, dynasties, and dramatic moments. A king, resettlement, break. But for anyone trying to remain Catholic inside the Church of England, the real issue was not merely what happened to the top, it was what happened to the Church's soul. The old unity with Rome was cut. But more than that, the English church became vulnerable to power outside herself, the state. The vulnerability is the shadow that runs through this episode. Because once the church is treated as something the state can supervise, regulate, or redesign, then even the most sincere attempt to remain Catholic inside that church becomes precarious. The question is no longer simply, what does the church believe? The question becomes, who gets to decide? The question would haunt English Christianity for centuries. The break with Rome didn't happen in a vacuum. It emerged from political crisis that turned into ecclesial crisis, and then into a spiritual crisis. The familiar details matter. Royal authority, succession, national identity, legal settlement. But for our purposes, the most important point is this. The English church was no longer free to think of itself as simply a part of the universal Catholic Church in communion with the See of Peter. It was increasingly defined by its relationship to the English crown and the English state. Thomas Cranmer stands at the beginning of that settlement, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury under Henry VIII. He helped shape a church in which the crown and parliament increasingly governed ecclesial life. Whether one views him as a reformer or a servant of the royal power, he represents the moment when the English church became tied to state authority in a new and lasting way. That shift did not just change administration, it changed imagination. If the church is no longer answerable to Rome in the way it had been, then the center of gravity moves. The church becomes nationalized. Its life becomes entangled with civil authority. Its bishops, clergy, and liturgy are all affected by the assumption that the state has a rightful role in determining the shape of the church's life. This is where the rupture becomes more than historical, it becomes structural. Because once the church is no longer free to act as a fully independent spiritual society, it is no longer possible to talk about unity, doctrine, or authority in the same way. Every attempt to be Catholic must now be made inside a framework that can override Catholic claims at any time. That is why the split mattered so deeply. It was not merely the communion was broken, it was that the new principle had entered the room. And that principle, Erastianism. Put simply, Erastianism is the idea that the state has final authority over the church in matters that belong to the church's own divine life. It means that civil power may regulate, supervise, and ultimately control ecclesial affairs. On paper, maybe that sounds tidy. A nation doesn't need order. A church needs boundaries. Everyone has a role. But In practice, it just means the church is no longer free to be fully herself. She becomes subject to forces that are not spiritual in origin. Her teaching can be constrained by politics. Her worship can be altered by law. Her very identity can be made contingent on the will of civil authorities. I mean, if you look at today, you can tell it's not just a small adjustment. It's a massive change in what the church is. For Anglican Catholics, this is not a side issue. It's the central wound. If the state can decide the terms of the church's life, then the church is never really fully at rest. She can never simply say, "This is the faith once delivered." She must also ask whether that faith is allowed, tolerated, revised, or suppressed. And that tension is exhausting. It creates a kind of spiritual uncertainty that no amount of ritual alone can fix. You may still have candles, vestments, may have the beautiful prayers, serious clergy. But if the underlying authority of structure is unstable, the whole arrangement is unstable with it. This is what Erastianism did to English Christianity. It made the church vulnerable from within her own national life. To understand why this matters so much, imagine what it feels like to belong to a church that is always aware that someone else may intervene. Not every day in a dramatic way, not always with obvious force, sometimes just through a background awareness. The state is there, Parliament is there, the courts are there, the crown is there, and the church must fit herself into that framework. It's like a trauma in the back of your mind that just plays. That kind of supervision changes the soul of communion. It means that even when the church wants to act Catholically, she may be unable to do so without qualification. This is why so many sincere Anglo-Catholics found themselves in a different position. They wanted the fullness of Catholic life. They wanted sacramental seriousness, apostolic continuity, liturgical reverence, and doctrinal integrity. But they were living inside a church whose very structure made those things insecure. They could try to recover the old inheritance. They could speak in Catholic terms. They could recover ritual, theology, and devotion. But they still remained inside a system whose deepest logic was not Catholic unity, but national establishment. And that meant the problem never really went away. It just waited. Faced with this reality, many Anglicans developed a way of thinking called the branch theory. And this was a theory that I personally held to for many years. The theory states that the one Catholic Church could be understood as existing in several branches: Roman, Eastern, and Anglican. The branches were thought to share a common inheritance, even though they were not in full visible communion. For me, the way I placed it before I even knew this term was, I live in America, but I don't need to live in Washington, D.C. to be a United States citizen. Likewise, just because I'm not Catholic doesn't mean I'm not part of the Catholic Church. But this is not a silly idea, it's an ingenious one, because it allows Anglicans and other Christians to say, we have not abandoned the Catholic Church, we are one of its branches. It gave people a way to remain where they are while continuing to claim continuity with the ancient church. It also helps to soften the embarrassment of separation. If you're not the whole church, but a branch of it, That being outside of Rome can be framed not as rebellion, but as a kind of legitimate regional existence. Again, not needing to be a part of Washington, D.C. to be an American citizen. You can tell yourself that the church is bigger than any one see, and the branch still belongs. That was emotionally and intellectually attractive. It gave people a way to stay. It gave me a way to stay. And for a while, that's enough for some. But the theory has a serious weakness. It explains separation, but it does not heal it. The problem with the branch theory is that it tries to make fragmentation feel like plurality. It gives theological language to what is in reality a wound. If the church is one, then separation from the center of unity is not a neutral fact. It's a problem. If the church is one, then visible communion matters. If the church is one, then the authority matters. And if the Bishop of Rome is truly the center of that unity, then no theory can make his absence irrelevant. And that's what made me personally as well leave Protestantism for the Catholic Church. The belief that the papacy was necessary and that it's truly the center of unity. But that's where Anglican Papalists parted company with more comfortable Anglican settlements. They were not satisfied with saying, "We are Catholic enough." They were not content to explain away the fracture as if an explanation or healing. They wanted unity. I wanted unity. And not a vague sentimental unity, a visible one, a real one, a unity grounded in communion with the See of Peter. That's why the branch theory was never fully satisfying. It can describe the situation, it can preserve hope, but it can't answer the deeper question. What is the church doing if she remains separated from the center of her own visible unity? And for them, the question kept pressing. The more seriously someone took Catholic ecclesiology, the harder it became to ignore. St. John Henry Newman is the clearest human figure for this tension. He was one of the great minds who tried to defend Anglican Catholicity from within, and the branch theory was part of the intellectual shelter that made that defense possible. But his own journey eventually showed how fragile the shelter was. The same mind that could argue for Anglican continuity eventually recognized that the theory could not bear the weight he had placed on it. And his own conversion to Rome made that realization unmistakable. And that's why the Anglican Catholic mind often sounded tired, even when it sounded confident. The theory was neat, the reality was not. And there was a real human cost to that in between state. It was the cost of trying to live as if a theory could do the work of communion. You can remain, you can explain, you can defend, but yeah, you haven't arrived. And that sense of incompletion is not just a theological problem, it becomes a spiritual burden. The consequence of Erastianism and the branch theory together is that Anglican Catholic identity became a life lived under pressure. There was pressure from the state because the church's life was tethered to national structures. There was pressure from Protestant identity because the Reformation settlements still shaped the broader religious culture. There was pressure within because the church's own Catholic claims couldn't be fully harmonized with her separated status. So Anglican Catholics were often living in a suspended condition. Love English liturgical and devotional inheritance, yet they believe in apostolic succession. and longed for the sacramental and doctrinal stability. But they were doing all of this inside of a framework that could never let them fully escape the question of Rome. The tension created a kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation only, but the loneliness of unresolved identity. You can only live on theory for so long before the theory starts to feel like a compromise. And compromise, while sometimes necessary in the short term, is a poor substitution for communion. If you're going to call yourself part of the body must be whole. Because if one part of the body hurts, then all the body hurts. And this is important because it's not abstract theological debate for people involved. It touches worship, belonging, and the church can survive a lot of argument. I mean, why else do we have councils? But when people begin to sense that the structure they love is unstable or unable to guarantee the unity it claims to preserve, something deeper starts to crack. And that was the experience for many who gravitated towards Catholic seriousness inside of Anglicanism. They weren't merely collecting rituals. They were trying to live in a church that could speak with authority and certainty. They wanted a home where Catholicity was not dependent on political convenience. And because that home was not yet available, they lived within the ache of partiality. And that's not melodrama. It is the ordinary pain of believers who know what they have is beautiful, but not yet whole. I remember when I personally came to the edge of this conversation for my own self, just looking at the pictures of all the leaders, or in the case of Orthodoxy, the most popular metropolitans. I knew that the papacy was the only way to keep us whole. And the shadow of the state mattered for them because the church was never fully free to resolve her own identity in her own terms. Even when Catholics in the Church of England tried to recover older forms, they still lived beneath a system that could revise, restrict, and reinterpret their efforts. That made the whole project fragile. It also meant that the question of authority could never be treated as merely one issue among many. The question behind every other question was whether the church had the right to govern herself according to the mind of Christ and the apostolic tradition, or whether she would always remain subject to external control. If the latter is true, then Catholic renewal inside the system will always be provisional. And that insecurity is exactly what many Anglican Papalists saw. They were not blind to the problem. They were among the clearest-eyed people in the room. Edward King, 2 centuries later, made that pressure visible in a more concrete way. His ritual practice brought the state's scrutiny into the open. And that fact that a bishop could become a public legal object lesson shows just how far the Erastian shadow had reached. What had begun as a principle of authority had become a system capable of policing devotion itself. All of this set the stage for a new kind of renewal in the 19th century. Because when the limitations of the post-Reformation settlement became impossible to ignore, some Anglicans began looking backward, not to retreat into nostalgia, but to recover a fuller memory of the church. They asked whether the Church of England had forgotten something essential about herself. They asked whether the sacramental, doctrinal, and liturgical life of the pre-Reformation church could be reclaimed. And they asked whether the line of continuity with the ancient church had truly been severed or merely obscured. Those questions would erupt in the Oxford movement. That movement would not solve everything, but it would reopen the possibility that Anglicanism had a Catholic future only if it took seriously the Catholic past it had tried to leave behind. In other words, the old wound was not gone, it was beginning to speak again. The branch theory offered a language for survival, but not a cure. It could describe the fracture, but it cannot heal it. And as long as the church remained vulnerable to the state, the question of authority would never go away. It would only deepen. The English church learned to live with that tension. Many people even learned to admire it. But admiration is not the same thing as peace, and the theory is not the same thing as reunion. In the next episode, we will turn to the Catholic revival. Newman, the Oxford movement, the ritualists, and the return of distinctly Catholic imagination in English church life. Because before there can be a homecoming, there has to be a remembering. This is the Anglican Papalist.